Well, how's everyone doing? You should be like super excited. First of all, Shabbat, right? Can you hand that for me? Thank you. It's Shabbat, right? And we're here today. We're alive. It's a day above ground, right? So it's always a good thing, right? So I want to read something to you. This portion covers so much. There's so much in here that we can talk about. We start with the woman in captivity, right? When you go out to war, how the Torah really bleeds into every aspect of our lives. And that's one of the things that this parasha is teaching us, is that the Torah is not just for the synagogue service. It's not just for the Beit Midrash. It really, really encompasses every facet of our lives. We see in here the woman in captivity, for instance. We see the wayward son, right? Another aspect that we see in here is concerns for properties for others, right? We have also male and female garments, right? A male shall not put on a female garments and vice versa, right? We have also the aspect of defamation of a married woman, even this portion in here, an accusation, a false one, supposedly a false one. In some cases, it could be true, but the Torah presents both cases in here. We also have the case of a divorced woman as well, or one who wants to divorce. So we can see how the Torah really it touches every basis of our lives. And, we end up with remembering Amalek and what Amalek did to the Jewish nation as well, right? So much to cover in here, right? Like, where do we start? But not to bore you with every aspect of it, if we can summarize the whole thing, really, it's about relationships with others and with society as well, right? How do we infuse the Torah into a society that may not necessarily recognize Torah? The Torah portion also reveals, based on what we're reading on the laws of every aspect that we just talked about or that I mentioned in here today, it kind of sets the climate of what the ancient world looked like. Pretty scary, right? If Hashem has to say, this is what you need to do, it means that the opposite is true, that they were doing it. You know what I mean? So it kind of shares really how ugly the world might have looked like. And when you look into the laws of the Code of Hammurabi, we can see really that the ancient world was a scary place, without any shadow of a doubt. Some people say that the world has become a worse place. I want to say that I think it actually become better. Because when you look at the things in here, it's like, wow. I don't know, when was the last time that you received a body part in your mail, by the way? You know what I mean? These are the kind of things that we look in the ancient world, to give you an example. You know what I mean? Like, we become more civilized. It's better. I will tend to say that it is better. Of course, not everybody would agree with that, but when you read into the ancient world, folks, it looked really, really bad. It's really, really horrible. So we see that in here, all these different things that the Torah has a concern with, and it really projects and it actually gives us an avenue of how we could serve as a light into a world. Before we actually get into this, though, I want to read something out of Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot 1:14. Rabbi Hillel said this. He used to say, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? It's a question, by the way. And if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? What is the meaning of all this? I want to be able to share some of this in here because it actually bleeds into what we're going to talk about here today concerning all of this. It says, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? What does that mean? It can be taken in many different opinions can come from this. But we want to really see what the Chachamim have to say about this, especially with the Rosh here, right? Said, I can inherit wealth from others, right? Easy to do. But I cannot attain personal perfection through fulfillment of Torah without doing the work myself. That's interesting, right? In other words, we cannot perfect our character and therefore help with the world if we ourselves are not actively doing this, right? If we're not working in ourselves, essentially. He's quoting in here from the Maharal as well. If I myself would not rouse my heart towards loftier things, who will? Think about that for a minute. If you're not your own source of inspiration, who will inspire you to do greater things? This is really here what Hillel is projecting to that generation. In other words, we have to find the one in ourselves to strive for loftier things. In other words, not just settle for the least, we want the best, right? That's kind of like the idea. I don't want to just know the word Torah. I want to learn how to walk it out every day. That's aspiring for more. You see what I mean? You're thirsting for something more. You know, if you ask any wealthy person who owns a major corporation in America, they didn't reach the level that they did because they were content where they were. They were aspiring for greater things every single day. They had a vision and they went for it. Using that same model, but bringing that into the religion arena and specifically in the Torah. We're not just aspiring for the bare minimum. We want more. We want to aspire for more. This is what he means when he says, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Inspiration will not come from the outside, Maharaj states. Cannot wait for somebody in the outside to inspire you. I am the only one with complete control over my actions, essentially. This is really, really, really beautiful. And if I'm only for myself, what am I? If I care only for myself and do not care for the welfare of others, what am I worth then? And if not now, when? That's a huge one, right? This is more arena of people who like to procrastinate, right? Well, we can do this today, but let's just wait until tomorrow. I know that the garage needs to be clean. We'll wait. We'll wait. 6 months down the road, 2 years down the road, the garage gets worse, right? But we can even, again, we can infuse this even with our endeavors and our goals, folks. I will get to, getting more motivated, but can I just be lazy one more day? Right? This is the concept in here. The urgency to want to become better. The urgency, that's the key, the urgency. And that urgency, it's what we see here in Parashat Tetse. As HaKadosh Baruch Hu here gives the Jewish nation standards that I believe are not just limited to a Jewish nation, for we see much in here, universal laws as well, as taking care of other people's property, for instance. Looking for the welfare of others. Why Tetse says it's an important parasha? Because the laws that are concerning in here really are the make it or break it of the universe. In other words, there are laws that actually keep the universe intact from completely depleting. Then there's extras, but then there are the main ones that keep us from falling apart completely. And much of that, we see it in this portion. I want to start with our reading for today. Because again, there was so much to cover in here, but what really attracted me today, it's the aspect of a slave. Why? Because when we think of a slave, we think somebody in shackles, right? Can you give me my coffee, please? Thank you. Appreciate it, man. Can't live without coffee, so oh Hashem. We think of a slave as a person who has shackles, right? That's not always the case. And that's what I want to bring, how Rishonim interpreted these passages that I'm going to read to you today so that we can see an in-depth of what's happening in here. You ever wonder why we don't have a perfect world today? Why? It's not a trick question. Why don't we have a perfect world today? Choices. Yeah, choices. Why don't we have a temple? Again, not a trick question. Why don't we have a temple today? What I mean by a temple, because you see the idea of a temple in Jerusalem, as Jerusalem is known as the central of the world, the location of having an actual temple was an indication to the world that God dwelt in the world. Now we understand God created everything. Oh, God is everywhere, right? He's not like in North America and then next week South America and then, he's everywhere. But as the sages say, God actually is hiding behind creation right now, which is why we can't see the wonderful things that we read so much about God, right? Like, when was the last time you went to your patio and you had a conversation with God? He actually was answering back audibly without you having any mushrooms before. That's the cue right there, okay? I'm talking about here, you had a normal meal, right? Assuming you didn't take drugs, right? And you weren't hearing things. Under the normal circumstances, that actually doesn't happen. It doesn't happen every day. We don't walk in here and say, hey, by the way, did you talk to God yesterday? What did he say to you? Audibly, he said this. Here, I got it in a recording. You want to hear it? Here. Why don't we have that? See, it's the question why most people don't believe in God. It's because we don't see him. We don't hear him. And to top it off, we don't even have a temple in Jerusalem anymore. I will submit to you that most of the reasons why we don't have a temple in Jerusalem, which, by the way, by default means that God is not dwelling here on earth with humans right now. It's just a metaphor to that, because when he's in the temple, it means he's here on earth dwelling with mankind. It's a lot of it has to do with the things that we're reading in this portion. Much of it has to do with relationships with one another, to be honest with you. Very little has to do with the actual rituals of the temple, but more of the rituals of how we communicate with one another and how we treat one another, which is why in this portion, it's so huge. So we want to pick the aspect of a slave. Listen what the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu says in here. How beautiful. Says, Lo tasgil evet el Adonai, asher yinatzel elecha, me'im Adonai, imcha yeshev bekirbecha, bamakom asher yivchar, be'echad, it says. In the very, very opening says, Lo tasgil evet. And that word tasgil brings us to what you shall not turn over, essentially. That's how it's translated. A slave to what? El Adonai, to his master. Now, much of this we think today, how do we fulfill this? Like, we don't got people walking around as slaves with shackles, escaping their masters, hopping on a donkey and we catch them in the middle. We don't see that. But as Chacham is going to teach us here today, much of this we see it today in more ways than others. So what is tasgil? Tasgil literally means, when it says you not turn over, it means do not turn away. You ever heard of the word extradite? That's what tasgil is. To extradite. Don't or turn away. Do not turn away an eved to his master. We're going to see really what's happening here. And I want to share some beautiful things. By the way, Tetse, the parasha, it's when you go out. That's why it says ki Tetse, when you go out. And it starts with the aspect of the woman in captivity. We're not going to talk about that today. but it kind of bleeds into everything because there's a lot of juxtaposing taking place in this portion, which why it's somewhat of a spider web. It all connects together, starting with the woman in captivity. So it says in here that you are not to turn the slave away. I want to take us to the Hirsch Humash to give us some more explanation. And the Hirsch Humash says the case, what it's talking about specifically in here of the slave, because again, you need to identify who's the slave. We can't just leave the slave as a blanket statement. It's what kind of slave we're talking about in here, right? So we need to identify what slave is the Torah speaking about. So it says in here, the case is that of an Eved Kanani, a Canaanite slave. Hirsch Humash goes on to say, who fled from a Jewish master. So this Canaanite slave, Zgoy, is under the ruleship of a Jewish master. Okay? Living outside of the land of Israel, escaped to the land of Israel, essentially. Which is a very interesting question. Why would the slave go to Israel? If the master is Jewish, the last place I want to go is to the land of the Jews. I'll be heading in the other direction. I'll be going to Hawaii. You know what I mean? Like doesn't make sense, right? Like, why were you going to a place where your master, like, it doesn't make sense. That's like me being under Korean leadership. I'm going to go move to Korea. But I'm escaping from a Korean, government, Well, they actually have answers in here because this is why it's so important to dig into the Torah so we can get better understanding. It says, the authorities in Israel, if this Eved Canaanite, this Canaanite slave, flees the Jewish master and goes to Israel, what is the obligation of the government of Israel at this point? It's a good question, right? Especially when we're talking about border control and everything nowadays, right? It kind of bleeds into a lot of things. Not going to get political here today, but I'm just saying we want to see this through the lens of the Torah, right? Says the authorities in Israel are obligated to grant this slave refuge and care. Most of you are just mama shock. I can see that. That's what it says. I'm not making this up. It says that you are to grant them refuge and care. According to the Ramban, whose view is accepted, they must, here, I gotta see, they must bring about the slave's release, and towards the end, they are to present the master with an alternative. And here's the alternative. Either he will give the slave a certificate of freedom in exchange for a promissory note for his value, or the court will strip him, that is the Jewish master, of his right and set the slave free. Interesting, isn't it? Very, very interesting, actually. Once the slave has been set free, he becomes, guess what he becomes? This is where it gets really interesting. Once the slave has been set free, this is a Canaanite slave, by the way, he becomes what they consider a ger tzedek. It's a ger tzedek. It's a convert. This is interesting. See what this is taking, what the spin on this. He becomes a ger tzedek with full rights of Jewish citizen, and he is under a special care of public law and goodwill as well. Very interesting, isn't it? I know I'm going to get tons of email over this one. Then it goes on to saying, going back to the reading of the Torah, says, Imcha yoshev bekirbecha bamakom asher yivchar be'echad. With you he shall live in your midst. Okay? And when it says bamakom asher yivchar, which is the word Hebrew bachar, which is what? To select. And he will select. Who selects it? The government selects it. It says the slave selects it specifically. Bamakom asher yivchar be'echa. In which city specifically, which place specifically he wants to be. But it says be'echad she'arecha, which is the gates of the city. Which gates of the cities you want to be in, essentially. Batov lo no nenu. You shall not what? Mistreat him. No nenu. Now, not no nenu, I'm sorry. Tonenu. So here's the key with this word, tonenu, which means you shall not oppress. Right? You should not mistreat him. But in reality, gives us this word back to oppressing. In other words, you don't oppress this person who has, in essence, is a slave who's running away from his master. What you ought to do, you have to welcome him. You have to grant him security. You have to comfort this person and help him, essentially. Now, why does the Torah command us to do this? We go, for instance, in Parashah Mishpatim. No coincidence this is Parashah Mishpatim. For instance, in Parashah Mishpatim 22:20, Exodus 22:20, to be specific. It says, the same word in here, says, Veger lo tone, meaning you, a foreigner, you shall not what? Oppress, it says. Why? Nor shall you oppress him, nor because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. See? Giving you that example in there as to why in here we're doing the same thing. I want to take us to Gittin. In Gittin 45, it says this, 45a specifically. The Baraita taught this very, very specific concept. What is it that has to do with the slave? What is the concept with the slave that is running from his master specifically? The verse states, with regard to the residents of the land of Canaan, they shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you to sin against me, for you will serve their gods, for they will be a snare to you. Exodus 23:33. The Baraita goes on to saying, one might have thought that the verse is also speaking of Gentile who accepted upon himself not to engage in idol worship. Right? And it's teaching that such a Gentile may not dwell in Eretz Israel as well. So what if you were a Canaanite who lived in the land of Canaan, but you rejected idolatry and you held on to radical monotheism? According to the Baraita in here in Chazal is, they have to grant you the rights to live in the land. It says in here, therefore the verse states, you shall not deliver to his master a slave who escaped to you from his master. And I want to continue in here. The Baraita understands that the verse is speaking in metaphoric terms about a Gentile who has come to Eretz Israel, escaping his idolatrous past, essentially. That's beautiful. Now, one doesn't neglect the other. They're taking, what they're doing is taking an actual physical concept that is real, an actual Canaanite who is running. But the Baraita is actually extending this to the extent of even a person who's not per se a literal physical slave, but rather comes from another culture of idolatry and is escaping that. Why? Because the sages of Israel also interpret that, being a slave is a physical aspect, but there's also a spiritual aspect of being a slave. Like you can be enslaved to your own ideas. You can be enslaved to, whatever. You name it. So in here, they're saying that this person who is escaping from their past, in essence, is a slave, just like the slave who leaves Canaan. The Baraita continues, what is the Gentile's remedy then? He shall dwell with you in your midst, essentially. This teaches that as long as he accepts upon himself not to engage in idol worship, he may remain in Eretz Israel, essentially. It's a beautiful thing, right? So when we look at this, it's pretty interesting, because when we go back to the verse in here, it says you should not hand over, which in essence, handing over means turning away. By the way, handing over is not just, it means literally to turn someone away. So if, for instance, you're coming to me because you want to learn, I'll put it in the way the Baraita is actually explaining this. If you're coming to me because you want to learn Torah, and I say, I'm sorry, I cannot teach you the Torah. Why? Because you're not Jewish. That essence, in essence, Chazal says that is wrong. That the Torah is for anyone who is escaping idolatry, anyone who wants to, again, assuming that you are genuine and you are escaping idolatry, right? And you want to come to learn the God of Israel. In this aspect, you are to accept them. But I want to share something with you, because there's a beautiful, powerful connection in here. Okay, I want to share, if you allow me to. And in 16, it says, you shall not turn over a slave to his master when he seeks refuge from you, from his master. Okay. Now, other commentators of the sages say that this can go both ways. This can be a Jewish master, but this can also mean that the slave comes from a Gentile master as well. So it can go both ways. It doesn't matter. It's not just specifically one. It can be either or. But what I want to share in here is something very powerful. When you take this verse, because it's talking about the slave, think about this for a minute. Just entertain me. The verse has everything to do in here with the slave running away from his past, in essence. Whether he's a literal slave, whether he's a metaphorically slave, it doesn't matter. Point being is, he's leaving one master to serve another. And that's really what it boils down to, right? We're going to see something very interesting. When you look at the gematria for that verse, it's going to mama shock you to see where and how it connects to another one. That's beautiful, right? This is beautiful. Milui gematria for this verse takes us to 5,731. Crazy as that is, a big number. But it's a whole verse, right? You will not guess where that verse takes us to, connecting with the slave that's running away from his master. If I were to tell you, you still wouldn't believe me. So I'm going to actually take you there. And this actually takes us, and let me look it up in here real quickly. And we are going to be in Parashah. We're going to go back to Parashah Lech Lecha, which is the parashah that has to do with Avinu Abraham. Which verse specifically does this connect us to this right here? 1723, to be exact. So the slave fleeing, the Canaanite slave fleeing from his past to go to Eretz Israel out of all places, to seek refuge, right? Now think about that in the spiritual way. You leave your past. You come to Eretz Israel. Why Eretz Israel? Again, why Eretz Israel? Because in Eretz Israel is where the Torah is. Where's the freedom? In the Torah. See? So going back to Genesis 17:23, look what it says. Then Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all the servants, talking about the Eved, all his servants who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's household, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the very same day as God has said to him. The Brit Milah in connection with the slave escaping. What's the connection? It's a huge connection. Because what does Brit Milah signify in Judaism? You becoming a new person. See, they left the status of their past and now have become what? Servants of Hashem, essentially. That's what is the Brit Milah. Brit Milah is a sign of the what? Of the covenant with Hashem. See? That you're going to be obedient to the Torah and, you're going to follow Torah and all this good stuff, right? And that you're going to worship only one God and that's it. No 5, 6, 7, 3, and 1, none of that. You're going to worship one true God and that's that. One, that's it. When you adhere to that, you essentially, in essence, two things happen according to Deuteronomy. Your circumcision, your Brit Milah. Your Brit Milah actually doesn't start in the actual flesh. Your Brit Milah actually starts in your heart, according to Deuteronomy. That's why in Deuteronomy it says, circumcise the foreskin of your heart, first thing, and be stiff-necked no longer. See? So really it starts with the heart, and then proceeds with the sign, which is in what happens in here. You see, this is why it's so beautiful. What happened with Ishmael and all those who were bought with him and there was that were born in his household. Same thing. There's a tradition with Eleazar. You ever know Eleazar? Eleazar was who? Abraham's faithful servant. Right? According to many of the Jewish tradition, it says that Eleazar himself was purchased after the war of the 4 kings that took place with Abraham. So this is the general idea in here is that this has to do with, in essence, coming to Israel, accepting the Torah upon yourself, right? And leaving behind your past. This is what's so beautiful about this, in my opinion. Okay, let's go back. So it says, with you he shall live. Imcha yeshev bekirbecha. Now, what does he mean with you he shall live? These are little things that we have to ask, folks. We can just read through this, and when we're talking about living, well, what does that mean? I don't know. Temporary, permanent. Yoshev also carries the understanding of sitting down. What exactly is the implication in here, to be specific? So Yoshev, which is Yeshev, means to reside and to settle. Often in Tanakh, the allusion to Yoshev means that, for instance, when it says that the nation of Israel, back in the Parashat Shemot, says that the nation of Israel were what? Yeshev in in Egypt, right? What was the implication of that? Well, later the prophets tells us what it is. It means that they have assimilated to Egyptian culture. They were there for so long that they became like Egyptians, basically. See? So when it says in here that the slave shall what? Imcha yeshev, that he is to literally not just live there, but that the Eved now is going to become like you, essentially. He'll become integrated with your people, essentially, to the point that you won't be able to tell the difference, in other words, just like what happened with the nation of Israel while they were in Egypt. And I say this because this is very important, folks, because we have a big problem today. Again, going back to the question, why is the temple not established yet? The only way you're going to answer that question if you know what caused it to be destroyed to begin with. That's the only way you can answer that. Like, why is it not up? Well, for the same reason why it got torn down. And much has not changed. And what is it? Baseless hatred. But it goes beyond baseless hatred. Because baseless hatred is pretty much, in thought, it's amongst them people. So, Jews hating Jews, basically. Which we see a lot of that, right? But even others. Like if you were to talk to anybody right now who actually physically lives in Israel, I don't think much people would disagree that the government in Israel is not necessarily being very, very charitable to people who are in need right now. In general, I'm saying. In the direction that it's going, in general. I don't live there, so I can't expound on that. I'm basing it on the people who live there. And I know there's always going to be two sides of the stories. But one thing for certain stands is that we know that there is an injustice and inequality. We see that everywhere. We see that in our own country, to be honest with you. See it all over the world, for the most part. What is it different with Israel, though? Different with Israel is that Israel is entrusted to be a light to the world. That's the difference. It's not that Israel is any worse than any other country. I think all countries are pretty much in the same boat, for the most part. But rather, one is being held responsible for a higher degree. Why? Because, I don't know, you're the boss. And the boss is the one that's always going to have a higher accountability. Israel was entrusted with the Torah to what? To share the Torah with the world, right? For this purpose right here, for what? Social justice. What are we seeing in this portion? Much of it has to do with social justice. Equality, how we treat one another. So on and so forth. With the stranger is very, very important. Because Hashem really, it's a matter of fact, you don't have to take my word for it. You just go to the Tanakh. Hashem over and over mentioned how much he loves the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. Why? Why does he love so much the stranger, the orphan, and the widow? Because they lack, right? An orphan doesn't have parents. So who cares for them? One who's destitute, who looks out for them, right? A slave has no identity. So kind of equated with the orphan in the same path. So Hashem is always looking after the ones who are in essence much in need, as opposed to one who has so much. And this is why with the aspect of the slave is so important. Now, why this is so important? Because we live in an age right now, folks, where this awareness of Torah, for some reason, mysterious as it can be, has come to what? To fruition now. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, if you would have said Torah, people would have looked at you like, what is that? Now, believe it or not, most people actually know what Torah is. It's not like taboo. It's like we all understand, yeah, that's that Jewish thing. The law, right? Anybody, for the most part. We have a sign in the front that says Torah. People that are non-Jewish are usually the ones that say, hey, this place is Jewish, right? They know that that's Torah. How do they know that? Because there's an awakening and awareness worldwide about the Torah. Now, with that comes problems. Why? Because now you have a flood of what? Going back to this portion, you don't have one slave running from his master. You have a flood of slaves running from their masters. And where are they going? Spiritually, Eretz Israel. Why? Because they're looking for Torah. And what's happening today is, unfortunately, they're doing the opposite, which is turning away. We don't want to know about you. Get away from here. Go to Hawaii. You know, it's much better over there. This is a big problem, folks. The very concept of the Torah says we should not to do this. And for anybody that is seeking for spiritual light and life, we have to share that life, and we have to share that life for every single one of them. Period. Even if they have ulterior reasons. That's their problem, not yours. Remember that. It's not your problem. By the way, it's not even your program. Because the Torah doesn't belong to you. The Torah belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Which something tells me that if they're not genuine, God knows better than you do. And God will see to it that, you know, the things are handled, they're taken care of. So, it says, a prostitute among the daughters of Israel, there shall not be a male prostitute among the sons of Israel. Okay? And this is actually very interesting. Some translation says a cult prostitute. They label it as that as well. But something that's going to really, really shock you is that when it says a prostitute among the daughters of Israel, what is the Hebrew word for prostitute there? Anybody know? Huh? Nope. If anybody has a Hebrew Bible, because you wouldn't believe me if I tell you, it'll shock you to the bone if I were to tell you what was the word there. You know? And it literally says, let me find it. Here we go. Kedeshah mifnot. What is Kedeshah? Same word for Kodesh. Holy. Same word. Same Shodesh. I mean, not same word. Same Shodesh. Same Shodesh for holy. The same word that we use for holy is the same word that the Tanakh uses in here for prostitute. So what's the difference? One has a cholam, one doesn't have a cholam. What do you mean by cholam? A vav. With a dagesh in the top. One is omitted and the other one is not omitted. It's the only distinction between both. So, a female prostitute set aside, Kodesh, remember that Kodesh just means to be set aside. You can be set aside for something good, or you can be set aside for something bad. See? We always associate it with something good because often that's the implication. Holy is something obviously good, set apart. But not necessarily anything that's set apart means for something good. Again, it could be for something bad. For instance, so in the Second Temple period, and prior to that, especially in the Roman and the Grecian world, they had temple prostitutes. And the idea was that was part of their service. These were actually priests who would do services for the people in the name of God. You see what I mean? But seriously, I mean, you think I'm joking. I'm not making this up. I couldn't possibly make this up. You have to read it so you can see. So that's the idea. The idea in here is that they were religious, but they were religious in a different direction. But they were still religious. So think about that today. So many people say, well, we're holy, but specifically, how are you holy? Set apart for what? Torah says that if you're not set apart for the Torah, then what are you set apart for? See? Food for thought, by the way. So, remember, kadosh means set apart. It's basically a special function. That's all. That's all it is. It's a special function that I'm separating the person to be able to perform or do for a specific reason. You know. Exodus 19:6 says, "Shall be to me." This is Hashem speaking to who? Israel, right? You want to hear something intriguing about this? This blows your mind. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. This is Hashem speaking to Rabbeinu Moshe, right? But what's interesting in here is that when it says that they are to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, it says Vegoi Kadosh. It's going to blow your mind. Why doesn't it say Ve'am Kadosh? A holy people. As Israel's known as what? Am Israel. Right? But why does it say Vegoi Kadosh? Literally, a holy Gentile. Vegoi Kadosh. I'm just speaking literal. I'm reading to you unfiltered, just literal. Why would it insert Goy there and not Am? It would be preferred to use Am, I'm just saying, to not confuse people, right? If you really think about it, folks, what is the nation of Israel is comprised of? Jews and non-Jews. That's why it says Vegoy Kadosh. You see what I mean? In other words, this, and by the way, I'm not making this up. There's actually in the Talmud, I think it's in Sanhedrin. Don't quote me on that. I have to revise it and see. But it says that a goy who abstains from idolatry, worships the one true God, it is actually associated and is equal to the what? The Kohen Hagadol, the high priest in the temple. Interesting. When you look at the building of the temple, especially Solomon's temple, who built the temple? Goy. It's the nations. Solomon didn't pick a hammer, I promise you. It was the nations that built the temple. This is very, very, very beautiful. This all connects, really. Why? That's for another teaching, not for today. But what's interesting is in here that it says Vegoy Kadosh, and here when the word says Kadosh, it has the Cholam. Meaning, it's not saying a prostitute. It's literally talking about a holy nation. Meaning complete dedication to what is morally good. Let's put it that way. So what is the nation of Israel supposed to be like? A morally good standing nation that seeks justice, equity, and looks out for the orphan, for the widows, and for the strangers, who shares the light that Isaiah talks about so much in Isaiah chapter 56, that the light will go forth from Jerusalem. Why from Jerusalem? Why is the light coming out from Jerusalem? Because it says that out of Zion will go forth the Torah. The Torah is also associated with the light. And this is what makes it so beautiful. You see? So, concluding here today, folks, we want to make sure that every day we are, as Hillel speaks specifically when we started this teaching, that we are always looking to perfect our character. This is the general idea, on all. You can't tell a person be a good person. You can't tell a person be obedient. Can't. The person has to start within themselves. Before we start talking about believing in God, believe in doing commandments, because at the end of the day, you still have to do commandments, right? Even if you're looking at bare minimum commandment, it's still commandment. Commandment is still commandment, whether positive or negative. There still needs to be a fear of heaven that is instilled within your neshama. And that fear of heaven, it's what Hillel is talking about, that we need to continue to nurture and water every single day. And if you're not there yet with the fear of heaven, maybe this is the season to start acquiring that fear of heaven. See what I mean? Do you know that Israel, and speaking of an Eved, because today we focus more on the slave, right? But do you know that Israel is also known as an Eved? A servant. Because Eved has the same wording and the same significance of a servant. What is the difference between believing in God and being a servant of God? Let me rephrase the question. If you believe in God, does that make you a servant of God? The answer is no. You don't have to be a servant of God to believe in God. I can believe in God and not be a servant of God. A servant is bound by the yoke of the master. There's the difference. I can believe in this great power, but I don't necessarily want to be in yoke with him. See what I mean? I can believe in the authority of anybody in here, but not necessarily I want to subject myself to your authority. But I believe in you. I believe that you exist. There's a difference. See? So our idea in here is that we want to go from a transformation of, first of all, God actually being tangible in our lives, to the process of actually becoming a servant of God. And what we read in here is What does the servant do? The morally right servant, not the prostitute. The morally right servant, what does he do? He looks to be free. He looks towards Israel. He's not going anywhere else. He's looking towards the land of Israel to free himself and to become what? Interesting. Free himself to serve. Right? That's the idea. So I pray that we will get that kind of fervency, and that we will continue to look in introspection, and that we will look to continue to water our souls and to draw inspiration within ourselves to want to be a true servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And through that, bring in the final redemption of Mashiach. May Hashem bless you and keep you. Thank you, guys.